This week, democratic institutions appear to be eroding in Illinois and around the world. From Capital News, Illinois, I'm Peter Hancock, and this is Capital Cast. Hello, and welcome to Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. In recent weeks, people in Chicago and throughout Illinois have had a front row seat to some unsettling events. The increased presence of federal officers, stepped up immigration enforcement, and even the threat of National Guard troops being deployed, all in the name of restoring law and order. So far, the judicial and legislative branches have both been slow to step in and check the expansion of executive power. Meanwhile, critics, opposition parties, and independent media are routinely vilified by the White House. My guest today is the author of a new book that aims to put these events into context. Because what we're seeing in Chicago and other major cities in the United States is not unique to America. Since the late 20th century and into the 21st century, many democratic countries around the world have seen an erosion of their basic institutions and values. Susan Stokes is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Her new book is called The Backsliders: Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies. It is out now from Princeton University Press. She writes about why this is happening now, what the common themes are that run through each country's experience, and what, if anything, we can do about it. Professor Stokes, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Peter. Thank you very much.
Okay, so your book couldn't be more timely, especially for someone like you who's based right there in Chicago. Obviously, you've been working on this for some time, even before the events in Chicago started unfolding. I'm sort of curious what drew you to this topic as a researcher.
It's interesting. I actually am not a scholar primarily of American politics. I study what we call comparative politics, which is basically looking at politics other than the United States. And my area of expertise in my profession, my career was Latin American politics. And as a comparative politics person, I was very aware that about 24 countries around the world that were democracies were experiencing what we now have come to call democratic backsliding or democratic erosion, meaning that presidents or prime ministers were elected through free and fair elections and then turned around and started undermining the institutions of their own democracies, busting norms, undermining the independence of the press, the courts, the legislature, and on and on. And so I became interested in this general topic. And in the meantime, we really began to experience exactly that in the United States. So my interest is partly local and partly international.
Okay. And so when you talk about democracies and you go into the definition of it there, this involves more than just a government where leaders are popularly elected. Can you talk a little bit about what constitutes a democratic society or a democratic country?
Well, as you can imagine, there are many different versions of what democracy is. There are some political scientists who sort of have a black and white, a country either is a democracy or it's not. Others are more concerned with the quality of democracy. But what I look at is, many of us are concerned with is the sort of underneath the particular institutions, the idea of accountability. So governments that are accountable, so not monarchies, not authoritarian regimes, if they're accountable to the people and also to co-equal branches of government, if they accountable in the sense of being under the control of, or being monitored by or influenced by, that's the essence of democracy. Those are really important aspects of democracy. So we care about free and fair elections because that's the major mechanism that citizens can use to say, okay, you had your chance. We're not happy with the outcomes. Let's try another government. We care a lot about what we call horizontal accountability. That is, governments that are constrained by courts and by legislatures and by the press, and by other agencies, because that makes them function better. It makes them have to obey the rule of law, to act in a kind of predictable and democratic manner. And not incidentally, if a government becomes unaccountable to co-equal and to branches of government and to independent agencies, that can lead down a path to a loss of accountability vis-a-vis voters. It's that kind of constraint from lateral constraint that can keep governments from deciding, well, we didn't like the way that election came out. We'll run it again, or we'll, set aside the outcome for some amount of time.
And so you write about not just what's been happening in the United States, and a lot of people would recognize immediately those events if they've been paying any attention to the news. But as a comparative politics scholar, you also write about what has happened recently in Great Britain and in Sweden, two other wealthy Western nations, South Africa, Venezuela, much of Latin America. Can you talk a little bit about why this seems to be happening now? It really, since, say, the 1990s up through the current time, what's happening around the globe that is either causing or is strongly associated with the erosion of democratic values and institutions?
I think there are two answers to that question. One of them that's my research has revealed is that income inequality is a key sort of structural factor that increases a country's risk of having its democracy backslide. That is a statistical finding, very robust. We couldn't get rid of it no matter how hard we tried. So it really is it really is the case that more than being a poor country or being an older democracy or a younger democracy, the sort of structural factor that really matters is income inequality. And that helps answer the question of why now? Why in the early 21st century are we seeing a wave of democratic backsliding? Because, of course, many countries have become much more unequal in the wake of globalization and the opening of economies and the moving of manufactured jobs from the global north to the global south. Income inequality has increased, not year on year, but pretty steadily. If you look at the trends in the United States or the countries you mentioned, all of them have become much more unequal in terms of income as well as in terms of wealth. So that's part of the answer. And then the other part of the answer, sort of why now, is that these governments influence each other. They kind of take the lead from one another. They're sort of demonstration effects or kind of contagion effects. So, Donald Trump is inspired by Viktor Orban, and copies some of the things he did, like Orban in Hungary. The prime minister
Hungary.
of Hungary undertook a sort of nationwide gerrymander to make it harder for voters to his party could survive in power with a smaller percentage of the votes. Donald Trump in turn was a great hero for Jair Bolsonaro in South America, and you see that's the case as well. So those are two factors, increasing income inequality in the latter decades of the 20th century, and then a kind of almost a copycat effect as well.
Well, and can you walk through how that works operationally? I mean, I know that you see statistical correlations between income inequality, and there's actually a measure for that. There's a common kind of statistical tool to measure that. But how do you get from income inequality to the erosion of democracy?
No, it's a great question, and I spend quite a bit of time in the book trying to reconstruct the sort of connective tissue that takes you from rising income inequality to democratic erosion. And there are several things that income inequality does. One is that fairly obviously, it's a source of frustration for common people, for many people. It's a source of the feeling that they're being left behind in a country where there are a lot of people who are doing very well and they're doing badly, and their children will be doing badly. Um, Income inequality also tends to be related to associated with partisan polarization, and polarized countries are lend themselves to democratic backsliding, basically because leaders of very polarized electorates can take advantage of the fact that voters will say to themselves, well, I don't love him, I don't love the things he's doing, but better him than the other side that we're so scared of. Um, and then there's some other, it's easier to persuade people that institutions don't work on their behalf, that there's kind of elitist in a very unequal society. There are also, I think, things that happen to wealthy people in very unequal societies. They're more prone to view people at the bottom as sort of a separate species and to lose a sense of empathy with them. That's a theory that goes back, I think, to Aristotle and to some earlier 20th century democratic theorists as well.
Okay, well, it's interesting you talk about how that started late 20th, early 21st century, because it was 20 years ago this year, in 2005, that New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman came out with his book, The World is Flat. And he was on all the talk show circuits. It was a best-selling book. And he talked at that time about three major events that he saw coalescing together. There was this explosion of new technology through the internet and personal computing, cell phones, the whole tech explosion in the early 20th century, the fall of communism, which was still very much just right in the rearview mirror at that time, and also globalization, the new global free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and others around the world like that. And he saw these things coalescing together and flattening out the world, making things equal, helping lift up the prospects of developing countries, evening things out, and that it presented new challenges for countries like the United States, but also new opportunities. Nobody was talking then about how globalization was going to contribute to the decline of democracy. So did Thomas Friedman get it wrong, or was he short-sighted, or did something else happen that nobody else anticipated at the time?
I shared, I think, back then a sense of optimism about many of the developments we saw around the world. One of them, just the rise of democratic governance in Latin America, in parts of Southern Europe that had been under dictatorship, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union eventually. Um, I think that many people were slow to see that there would be some significant downsides to globalization because there are upsides to globalization. I mean, there have been increases in the standard of living of many people in many parts of the world who have been able to gain access to consumer goods at much lower prices, and there have been work opportunities opened up. China is an absolute miracle in terms of the number of people who've been raised out of poverty, and that has a lot to do with China becoming inserted into the world economy. Um, on the other hand, I think what Friedman and many people missed was the effect of the effect of globalization on income structures and wealth structures, particularly in the sort of global north, where there would be a loss of manufacturing jobs and an accelerated shift to service sectors, which tended to be lower paid. And also the decline of labor unions is another factor that contributed greatly. And that had to do in part with the loss of manufacturing jobs and shift to service sectors that are harder to organize, but also just political decisions. The Reagan administration with the Pat Coat strike and so on, and similar kinds of developments in the UK and other parts of the world. So I think that many people, I wouldn't put it on Friedman, I think many people saw upsides to globalization, which were quite real, and failed to see some of the downsides. The theory was that you lose certain manufacturing sectors of the economy, that there's going to be a deindustrialization, but you have worker retraining and you sort of redeploy people into other more productive sectors of the economy, and their incomes won't suffer. And it turns out that that may happen. It doesn't happen spontaneously on its own. And it also leaves a lot of people behind. It's not that easy to retrain. Older workers get left behind. And there was just a good deal of disappointment with that part of it. So I think that I wouldn't say it's a consensus now, but I think there is a broader sense now that there were some real costs to globalization, which were not sufficiently recognized in advance.
And you also write in the book about how different countries went in different directions. The wealthier nations in the north, the U.S., the U.K., Sweden, and even maybe Hungary and Poland, started shifting toward right-wing ethno-nationalism. Whereas in Latin America and some of the southern developing countries, they shifted toward left-wing, more populist kinds of governments, but both sliding away from democratic institutions. Uh, can you explain why the two different directions? What propels rich countries to go to the right and poorer countries to go to the left?
You're absolutely right. So democratic backsliding is undertaken by politicians of two basic flavors. One is right-wing ethno-nationalists, and the other is left-wing populists. The right-wing ethno-nationalists appear more frequently in the global north, and they are often a byproduct of changes in the kind of incentives that political parties faced in the latter decades of the 20th century. So if you kind of wind back to say the 1980s and think about the US, the UK, Northern European countries, the industrial working class was shrinking. The number of people with college degrees was growing. And political parties of the sort of center left, Social Democrats, the Democratic Party in the United States, had incentives to cater to more affluent, college educated city dwellers. And that didn't mean that they abandoned a kind of commitment to social policy and to welfare states, but it did mean that their brand as kind of the parties of the working class and of labor became weaker, became more kind of blurred. Um, and um, and on the other hand, so that happened, and the other part of that was what we were just talking about, a kind of convergence of the center left parties with the conservative, the business oriented parties. So, the Republicans in the United States, the Tories in the UK, and so forth, a convergence of those two kinds of parties around a program of globalization. And in the meantime, the conservative parties tended to stay pretty much where they were. They were small state, light regulation, and in favor also of a kind of globalization, of insertion of their economies into the world markets. And what that did was open up a space for, especially when the downsides of those policies began to settle in, it opened up space for political movements that were more economically nationalist, so more questioning globalization, um, somewhat more on a little bit sort of in between, let's say, a kind of pro welfare state and a kind of light regulation position on economic involvement. And then these parties, what I'm calling right-wing ethno-nationalists, also started to emphasize a kind of xenophobic, kind of anti-minority, anti-immigrant, sort of focusing on an idea of the nation is made up properly of certain kinds of people and others need to be excluded. So those are the people who push Brexit in the UK. It's the Sweden Democrats. It's the AfD in Germany. It's the MAGA part of the Republican Party of the United States. And those parties sometimes came to power, and they sometimes, when they were in power, they started undermining democratic institutions. And why did they do that? Well, they wanted to get votes. They could get votes among the sort of disgruntled, left behind parts of the population by blaming migrants, minorities, and so on. And they also had a kind of break the institutions attitude because they were breaking with the legacy political parties. They were trying to create a different space for themselves in the party system. So that's what it kind of looked like in a generalized sense in the global north. In Latin America, in more sort of global south democracies, that tended to be that the divisions tended to be more purely economic. And I think that had to do with a kind of greater income disparities and a kind of tradition of populist politics that identified the enemy not so much in terms of ethnic groups or religious minorities, in part because of the composition of the societies, but rather in terms of an economic elite corporations, and the like. So there, the politics was more kind of left-right and less ethno-nationalist.
I'm also sort of curious, and you write about this, but how do these backsliding leaders get away with it? Is democracy itself becoming less popular around the world? Are the voters and asking to move away from democracy? Are they attracted to authoritarianism, or is
Come on.
something else going on?
No, it's one of the most important questions of our day. Some voters, favor more authoritarian kinds of patterns of government and kinds of governing. For the most part, that's not true. For the most part, what we find is it's not a sort of spontaneous up from the bottom rejection of democracy. If there's a questioning of democratic institutions, it's more oriented towards specific institutions, the courts, the election administration, the press, and so forth. And that tends to be fostered by political leaders, by these kinds of political leaders, the right-wing ethno-nationalist leaders, the left-wing populist ones who are ambitious for power, understand that these messages can have a strong echo, and that if they undermine confidence in institutions, that's a route toward not, keeping the courts from getting in the way of their plans, keeping election administrators from saying that there was no fraud when there actually was no fraud, and so on. Um, so it isn't that there's a kind of global rejection, certainly not an up from the bottom global rejection of democracy. It's much more that people are frustrated. They're open to the argument that institutions are elitist and they're out to get them, and that the powerful leader is the person who's going to protect them from these sort of rapacious, corrupt institutions.
Okay, and so to bring it all back home, what are we to do about this? What are people here in Illinois to do about this when they see ICE agents knocking on their neighbors' doors, or we haven't seen the National Guard yet, and it's possible that we won't. But um, what are what are we to do at an individual or a local level?
So the sending the National Guard to DC, the threat to do so in Chicago, the actions in Los Angeles, many of those actions have appeared to ignore the rule of law and constitutional principles, and certainly in Los Angeles, we had a decision by a federal judge that they were in fact unlawful, and so that's part of a picture of governments that are willing to trample on really basic kind of institutions of democracy, such as the rule of law, such as respect for constitutional principles, um, and and hope that they won't be stopped. So what do common people who, you know, just citizens like you and me, what do we do? Um, I think that the odd thing in the United States is that we have a kind of autocratizing or sort of semi-authoritarian, let's say, White House. But we are still very much a democratic society. I think that's really in our DNA. And so many people, many citizens around the country, young, old, black, white, Latino, gay, straight, etc., are very much put off and fearful of the kind of violations of rule of law that we're seeing around. And I think it's interesting to look at what's happened with public opinion on the immigration issue. The Trump administration, they get pretty good poll numbers if you just ask people about the border. But if you ask them about the deportation policies, it's very unpopular because, people have, I think, a natural distaste for kind of really heavy-handed and sometimes violent actions by, masked people from the government who, who don't appear to be acting in a lawful manner. I think there's a, whether you're left or right, there's a basic sort of don't tread on me, libertarianism that many, or pro-liberty, let's say, sentiment that a lot of Americans feel. And so you've seen, protests, and you've seen people trying to keep track and document with videos or whatever these actions, and all of that is very important. And I would also say maybe resisting polarization, because polarization is a kind of a green light for would-be autocrats. So remembering that when you're, getting tired of your uncle, um, Fred, who seems to have, crazy ideas of things, remember that, maybe you're both Cubs fans and that, people have a lot more in common often than they have. One of the things that these kinds of politicians try to persuade us of is that all that matters is our party identities, and maybe our kind of racial or ethnic identities, and the other stuff doesn't matter, and all that stuff lines up. And that's just not true. It's not a fact. And so remembering that and reminding other people that we don't need to be polarized in that way is can be very helpful as well.
All right. Susan Stokes from the University of Chicago. Her book is called Backsliders: Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies. It's out from Princeton University Press. And that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for being here.